Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Green Chemistry Connections. We're very excited to launch this kind of, sort of building off of some of the webinars that we had over the summer, or early in the spring and summer, I should say. We're still in the summer, although fall is rapidly approaching. So we're really excited to help bring you guys all together, bring us all together around some discussions that hopefully will help us throughout the fall and throughout the coming academic year. My name's Amy Cannon. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Beyond Benign. I'm happy to have a couple more Beyond Benign staff and other partners on the line here. We have Irv Levy, our Senior Faculty Advisor, waving. Irv's here, and you're going to hear from Natalie in a minute too. Natalie O'Neill, our Higher Ed Program Manager, which most of you have interacted with Natalie over to plan this meeting as well. We have Juliana Vidal on the line too, our social media extraordinaire, joining us now from Canada, no longer from Brazil, now in Canada. And then you're going to hear from some of our faculty fellows too that are on the line here. So I'm gonna save it for you guys. That'll be coming soon. You'll hear from them. So I guess you can jump to the next slide, Natalie. It's fine. I know there's still some people joining, so So today's agenda, we're going to do a short welcome, and then we're going to jump into some networking and introductions. As you saw from some of the announcements, Natalie's going to explain it a little bit more, but we're hoping that you brought your own resource or request. And if you didn't, that's okay too. We also don't want to put pressure on you guys, but we do want to create some space for some dialogue and discussion. And then you're going to hear from, like I said, some of our faculty fellows that are working with us throughout the year. So on the topic of our Toxicology for Chemists curriculum, and that is ongoing and coming soon. So you'll hear from two of our faculty fellows, and then a new inorganic faculty fellow that you'll hear from a little bit later. And then we'll do some breakout rooms to have some more, hopefully, dive a little deeper into some discussions, that sort of thing. So with that, I know Natalie's going to explain a little bit more about the agenda later too. So next slide, please. So in sort of thinking through this green chemistry connections, what are we wanting to do? Us as an organization, I've been fortunate to be part of, co-founded this organization Beyond Benign back in 2007. And that's solely dedicated to green chemistry education. So I feel very fortunate that this has been my day job for 13 years or so now, to really advance the adoption of green chemistry in K through 12 and higher ed. And so, we've been thinking a lot about what is it that we want to do, and how do we take an idea or an innovation, which green chemistry in education certainly is an innovation, but what does it really take to take that idea and bring it to full adoption? And we've been doing a lot of thinking around this. Next slide. Digging into some of the theories that are out there. The Everett Rogers, he was one of the first people, which I was like, somebody coined this phrase, but apparently he coined the phrase early adopters. So he did a lot of studying on what it took to bring a technology or an innovation to fruition, really, and what are those factors. So he has this theory called diffusion of innovations. And innovation can, again, be an idea, it can be a technology, it can be many different things. And so there was really 4 pieces of this. The first one is really the idea itself. And so we think green chemistry education, that's a pretty good idea. And I think we have a lot of buy-in that idea is a pretty good idea. Next click. Communication channels. So having good communication channels, right? So how effective are those communication channels at getting people to really understand that idea and to get that buy-in? Next click, time. Right? So sometimes it just takes longer, right? And so time is a big factor in there. And then finally, in this theory, the last piece is what is the social system around these innovations, around these ideas? And next slide. It turns out that these social systems and social networks are really effective. They're really the primary vehicle for really driving these innovations, right? And so if you take this sort of theory that was developed around things like technology, not necessarily around education, but and you apply them to education reform, which is kind of the area that we're in here, trying to transform the way we teach and practice chemistry. If you apply them over here, it turns out that there's all kinds of benefits in education reforms for these setting up these social networks and really having these social networks, that they're really essential. And so, you know, for communications, obviously having effective communications for getting that idea out and getting it to spread, knowledge transfer, right? So transferring, you know, your own unique knowledge to others that want to, you know, that buy-in, access to expertise that you might not have yourself, which again, is in this community of green chemistry education, most of us haven't had this in our background in our training. So that's really important, having that access to that expertise. Leadership development, we always need, there's always a need for that pipeline of leaders. And it's really important to have that social construct together to really develop those leaders. Social capital was one of the ones that was most interesting to me in this. And I feel like it's super valuable to have that social, you know, the social aspect, which means basically there's resources that are embedded in relationships with people, right? And that social structure, that when you need to tap into those relationships and tap into those networks to mobilize people to create change, that social capital is really essential. And so that to me is super powerful in some of these social networks. And I think we have that building and growing, that it's been growing and building within the green chemistry education for a number of years. And finally, risk-taking. You know, it turns out that there's you know, strength in numbers. So if you know, a person knows that many of their peers are maybe taking on some of this risky behavior and adopting some of these technologies that are sort of bucking the system, that they might feel more comfortable doing it themselves and engaging in that sort of risky behavior. So there's so many benefits in really trying to bring people in together through this social networking. We're hopeful that we can continue and start this conversation here and continue it on a regular monthly basis that Natalie's set up. So anyway, just starting with sort of why are we all here? Hopefully we're bringing the community together in a meaningful way so that we can tap into that sort of social capital through you guys when we actually want to mobilize and really create some good, meaningful change together. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Natalie, to carry on.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. I really asked Amy to give that kind of short introduction to us here because what we really heard from the annual summit, and if you attended our annual summit, thank you for joining us during that. That was also an experiment here. But from what the feedback we got from that was that there's really a time in racing right now. What we're missing right now is community. And so we're going to be hosting these Green Chemistry Connections. They're going to be monthly meetings for the community. It's open to anyone to join. I would say these are focused at our higher education audience because they are being run by our higher education team and through what we've learned from the Green Chemistry Commitment Program. And so we invite you to join us, invite you to invite others to join us, maybe your department colleagues, your students, but we're going to be hosting them. And we see this as a way to share resources. So what is Beyond Benign doing, but what are you doing? And how can we connect you between all the amazing people that are within this network? And also, how can we support you? So figuring out how can Beyond Benign kind of accelerate that adoption of this great idea of green chemistry education that we have going on in the community. So I just want to quickly mention about the Green Chemistry Commitment. We've got 70 signers globally. It's really a flexible program. We're again basing these discussions that we're having monthly around the green chemistry student learning objectives. So theory, toxicology, laboratory skills, and application. So that's what you can expect in terms of the discussion that we'll have here monthly is going to be around those topics. Based off of the Green Chemistry Commitment. And of course, everyone is invited to join us in this discussion. So you'll see throughout my PowerPoint, if you're associated with a Green Chemistry Commitment school, there's a little signer logo next to you. If not, there's not. And we are welcome and open to anyone. You do not have to specifically be a Green Chemistry Commitment signer to join us in this discussion. There are just case studies that were released, so I just want to highlight these quickly. If you're looking for how are other people doing green chemistry education, there are 5 now up on our website, and this links over, so we'll save these PDF as a PDF file into the shared Google Dropbox when they're done, but there's a ton of resources for the Green Chemistry Commitment as well in that shared Google file that was shared at the beginning of the meeting. So some opportunities within the Green Chemistry Commitment. There's a bunch here. One is networking, curriculum, collective voice, shaping the commitment. I would say the biggest one is tracking progress. So when we say Green Chemistry Commitment and you're looking at greening your curriculum, how, on what timeline, and when is really all up to you within the Green Chemistry Commitment program. So one of these I just want to highlight because Irv Levy, who's our senior faculty advisor, is now the chair of our Green Chemistry Commitment Advisory Board. And Irv is going to be reaching out to our current advisory board members, but we're really asking the community to come and help shape the Green Chemistry Commitment. And this is really open to anyone that would like to be involved in this work. So you don't necessarily need to be a faculty member, you could be in industry, you could be in a nonprofit. It's really in terms of where should we be moving the Green Chemistry Commitment to, and that's that advisory group that helps us decide that based on the current things in industry and in academia and all of those. So we do invite you to join the conversation on the line. We did mention earlier, Juliana Vidal is here in person with us here, so you may meet her during the networking times, but she is the guru of our social media land. So we ask you to join us in the conversation on Twitter or on Facebook. I already know that there are people on Twitter that are going to be looking for that hashtag for the things that come out of that meeting today, because not everybody can join us live. So if you are so inclined to be on social media, please share what you are seeing today with the greater community overall. And I just want to highlight that we do have a new news section on Beyond Benign and specifically focused at higher ed, but also our K-12 programs and just general green chemistry news in general. This is specifically from the higher ed page. And so if you have news within your space, we would love to promote it for you. We just recently wrote an article, well, Juliana helped write an article for some undergraduate students that are starting their own spin out of the University of Toronto. And so that was a great thing to highlight, that they had learned about green chemistry education in their chemistry courses. And then when they were thinking about what they wanted to do next, they went into innovation. And the reason was because they learned about solvents in their undergraduate as being a problem, and they thought that they had a pretty clever solution. So that was a great story to highlight. So we would love to highlight anything that you have within your realm of green chemistry education to the community. So send it to us. It's called Community News, and we'll make sure that we send you the link in the follow-ups, of course. Just the last thing to highlight is that we do have virtual resources for the higher ed space. So this is a whole new topic underneath the curriculum focused at the current times that we have here. This is an active and growing list, meaning if people reach out to me and they've created a resource, I add it with a short little content blurb here and it is there. We would be happy to add anything that you're currently using or you plan to use or something that you develop onto this list, but know this list is here as a resource for your online endeavors this semester. All right. So with that, I'm just going to stop and say, are there any questions at this point? And maybe I'll turn it over to Amy just quickly as I set up the breakout rooms.
Okay, great. So Oh, we're doing breakout rooms for the bring your own resource. Yes, that's right. Great. So this part, we're just going to be doing the breakout into breakout groups, and we're doing, again, bring your own resource or request. We're going to try to keep them a little bit on the shorter side, recognizing that, discussions do happen. So how many breakout rooms are we setting up here? I think we've got.
Sorry, just realized I'm muted. We're going to set up 4 breakout rooms. That's going to be about 7 people each, which would be great in terms of our timing to keep it as short as possible to kind of interact with each other during this time and then join us back for the presentations. So I'm going to send you off into the rooms and then I will see you there. So,
and Natalie will call us back too.
Yes, I will call you back. So here you can see the slide it's bring your own resource. So your name, where you're from, resource or request, of course, open to anything, and go. So I'm sending you to a room now. We've got about 17 seconds left for everybody to get kicked back in here. So as we have everyone rejoining us, if Doug is back, oh, we'll give him a few more seconds.
Here we are. We got pulled back.
We got pulled back.
Some of us wanted to stay for the conversations, but it's all good. It's all good. More to follow up on.
I am thrilled to hear that. As the one that just sends you off into the abyss, I'm often like, what is going on out there? So I'm thrilled to hear that, and I welcome you all back. We've had a few more people join us in the time during that networking interaction. So if you didn't get a chance to, there will be another breakout session later on in today's connection. But right now, we're going to have a short intro and talks from our Toxicology for Chemists Fellow. So I'm going to show you a slide and just introduce you to our Toxicology for Chemists Fellows for 2020 and 2021. So we have Doug Raynie.
Excuse me, Natalie. Excuse me. I think your sound is on and off. Cannot hear correctly. Like sometimes soft, sometimes loud. Yeah.
No. How am I now?
Not good.
Hey,
when Amy talk, it's very clear, loud and clear. I don't know if it happened to other people or not, but it happened to me.
Anyone else?
Sorry.
Can I get some head shakes or some no? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Natalie, your sound is very muted. It sounds like you don't have a very good quality microphone for some reason. So sometimes it does fade in and out. I mean, I've been able to hear the entire time, but sometimes it's been very, very quiet.
Oh, geez. Sorry, guys. All right. I'm working my best over here.
I think you should hold that close to your mouth, the microphone.
How are we doing now? Better? All right. So I'm happy to introduce the Toxicology for Chemists Fellows, the 2021, until 2021. So we have Doug Raynie, who's an associate professor from South Dakota State University. He's done some work with us at Beyond Benign and past experience with toxicology, coming from a green chemistry commitment school. And then we have Julian Silverman, who's an assistant professor in Manhattan College, just starting out as an assistant professor. I believe this is your first year at Manhattan College, and is going to be working with us in what he'll be doing in his toxicology courses there. So I'm going to give you just those short introductions to them, and I'm going to say, Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us your insights on toxicology and what you've been doing in that space. And I will work on my sound.
All right, thank you. I think you can see my screen now. So yeah, as Natalie mentioned, South Dakota State University, whenever I say we were an inaugural signer of the green chemistry commitment, that doesn't sound quite right, because Amy says that's 2013, and we've been interacting with Beyond Benign and Amy and John for years before that. I think we started teaching toxicology 2010-ish, 9-ish, as a separate course, and I'm going to talk about that. And then what I intend to do today is present a couple different models that you can use for teaching toxicology in your universities. Because I think toxicology, of all of the principles of green chemistry, of all of the things we commit to in the green chemistry commitment, toxicology is the one probably hang up that a lot of chemists have, because as John has said and others, we're trained as chemists, we're not trained as toxicologists. And so how do we introduce that topic? And so first of all, I'd like to talk about one model that we've used quite successfully, although we've moved away from that. And to introduce that, I first want to mention that at the time we did this, we used a version of a 1-2-1 curriculum, where students took a semester of Gen Chem, followed by a year of organic, followed by the second semester of Gen Chem. And this was for our honors majors, so somewhat small classes. And what we did in that second semester, or first organic course that the students take, we just started to introduce a sampling of toxicological principles. We'd already been teaching toxicology for 2 or 3 years as a separate course prior to this, but we thought this would help whet the students' appetite for the topic. And so again, just as part of the natural discussion of an organic curriculum, as they introduce stereochemistry, we could introduce case studies involving thalidomide and how the D and the L isomers, their physiological activity is quite different. Talk about exposure dose, introduce dose response. When we talk about halogenation, some of the issues with PFAS can be brought up, environmental exposure, remediation, and so forth. Same thing with aromatic compounds. We tied that to grilling food and exposure routes, introduced toxicokinetics, toxicodynamics very briefly. And then probably the highlight was in the lab, we did a toxicology assay, the MTT assay that some of you may be familiar with. And in particular, we introduced fat-soluble vitamins as the reagent we wanted to measure the activity, the toxicological activity of, because if we started thinking what compounds could we use, and of course college kids know that there's toxicological consequences of caffeine and nicotine and those kind of common chemicals that they're familiar with, but they're bombarded with all sorts of energy fortified drinks and foods and whatever. And so this got us to introduce the principle of, everything's a toxin, it's a matter of dose. So that worked fairly successfully. And now, there we go. Beyond that, we had talked, and we haven't been as successful or as proactive in moving toxicology into other courses that you might be interested in. But in second semester organic, the professor from the first class that we did this project with, he's moved on to a different university, but he had intended to do a synthesis of a drug compound and introduce a different type of bioassay, as well as doing an activity associated with that compound using the EpiSuite database. In green chemistry, my research group has introduced in analytical chemistry, has introduced a metric for assessing how green an analytical method is, and we started to introduce that into our analytical course, and then we do extractions analysis of environmental toxins in soils and environmental waters and so forth. And there's a natural fit between toxicology and environmental chemistry. I'm not going to talk about that because I believe that's what Julian's presentation will be about in just a moment. But the other thing we've done, and it actually preceded what we did, was develop a separate course in toxicology. But what I just got done mentioning, integrating toxicology throughout the curriculum has two major advantages. One, it helps get rid of the criticism that there's no room in the curriculum to introduce a new course. But also it helps reinforce to the students that toxicology and toxicological implications are part of the normal practice of chemistry, what should be part of our natural thought process as chemists. So the new course, and actually, like I said, this was 2009, I believe we introduced this for the first time, a 3-credit lecture in chemical toxicology. We teach it at both the 400 and 500 level, so graduate students can take it as well. I just started, we start up classes next week, and so I've started to work on my syllabus, and this is the first part of the syllabus. The main thing I want to point out is down at the bottom, this is our catalog description, understanding principles of toxicology, including the molecular basis for toxicology and fate and transport of chemicals in the environment. But more specifically, in terms of sharing and providing resources, as part of the green chemistry commitment, there's a toxicology working group that I'm going to mention in just a moment that is developing a series of modules so that anyone, they'll be open share, open source, so that any person could go out and adopt them for their course, either through the integrative fashion that I mentioned or through developing a new course. We use the Tox Tutor that NIH has, and I'll mention that in just a moment. I use some YouTube videos as well as the videos that Yale University developed in their modern program. And then some of you might be familiar with the Environmental Health Network. They send out a daily email called Above the Fold, where they glean environmental or toxicological news from a lot of the popular press or general magazines. And each week, the students on Tuesday will pick one article that appeared in the previous week to discuss on Thursday. And we'll discuss things like, what's the magnitude of the problem? Who's responsible? Who does it impact? What solutions are there? Things to get them thinking about interacting with their knowledge, developing knowledge of toxicology and the public. I mentioned I use a modified flipped classroom, and so as the flipping aspect, I require the students to use the Tox Tutor. That's a self-paced tutorial developed by NIH. I have them register because I want to see the certificate of completion, and you can see the various topics, and you'll see a relationship between those topics and the topics that are being developed by this working group within the Green Chemistry Commitment. And so this year, as part of the fellowship with Beyond Benign, we'll be piloting these materials in our course and report out the successes, the areas of improvement that are needed. You'll see the team that's developing those, John and Amy, Dahlia, Saskia, Carolina, some names you're probably familiar with, but names you're probably maybe less familiar with. Wendy at the Boston University School of Public Health, Brian Brooks at Baylor, team from Dow Chemical and Industry. So we have some real toxicologists involved too, to kind of get this interplay between how we can lower the barrier for chemists to introduce toxicology to our students. So Natalie said 5 minutes, I probably took 10, so I'm going to pass it over to Julian.
Awesome. Thank you, Doug, for telling us all of that. And I did put some links into the chat around the toxicology work if you'd like to know more. So we can transition over now. If you'll stop sharing your screen, Doug, so we can get Julian's presentation up there. So Julian, I will pass it over to you and feel free to take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, Doug, for setting me up so well. While he was looking more at perhaps upper level chemistry courses, I'm going to also talk about how we bring chemistry into other courses like an environmental science course. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a specific homework assignment that I've been developing around an open access tool. And it was inspired in part by a podcast that I know and love, the Anthropocene Reviewed, which is sort of a comical and light take on a variety of things, often science topics. But I was thinking about how my students, many of whom may not be chemists, review chemicals in their everyday life, right? They look at the back of a food bag or a cosmetic product and they say, I can't pronounce that, or really, I don't know what that is. And so this is really an introduction to safety data sheets, but in the perspective of, toxicology and environmental science as well. So really the whole focus here was to use, again, open access tools. So these are things that students, maybe they have to sign up for, but they're free to use. And also they're usually collections of data, which we handle in science all the time. So to give a little background of the specific assignment, this is a later in the first semester of a Chemistry 101 or Environmental Science 101. The premise here is they know what chemicals are. They can maybe name, talk about structure, but they of course are now beginning to think about things like function. And so at Manhattan College, where I work, I'm looking at a course where I might not have many chemists or even many scientists in it. It might be engineers or liberal arts students. And so we have a very diverse group. And, you have to think about that when you're crafting an assignment. And so specifically what I'm going to talk about is how we might do something like determine the learning outcomes, right? What we want our students to have achieved. Then what sorts of online tools are useful, and then the specific example of this assignment that I'll be using this semester. Know that this is the whole topic of many discussions, right? And so I'll just touch on these, but feel free to reach out to me if you ever have any questions. I really like to start with learning outcomes, not only in a course or with an assignment, because it helps guide not only me, but my students. They can always refer to why they're doing what they're doing, right? Why they're looking at these sometimes poorly compiled safety data sheets, for example. And so the first thing I always try to do is use those verbs from Bloom's taxonomy, which we'll see in just a moment, where we're giving them specific objectives. So you can see here my goals in this assignment are to have students not only find safety data sheets or information, but then also begin to analyze it, right? Question, not so much perhaps whether it's reliable yet, that's a different assignment, but how the ideas connect, right? What does perhaps the PPE you wear relate to how a chemical might be hazardous in the environment or in a workspace. And then lastly, sort of the fun part, maybe looking at more of a humanistic or communication side of things, is going to be the review, right? They're going to come up with a rather short review, which again, there are many perspectives to take on whether a chemical is good or bad, but this will help guide them and help them see some of that gray area in between. And there we go. So the way that I structure really all my assignments and much of the courses I work on with students is having them first collect data, then analyze it and present it. Now, not every assignment will have all of these pieces, but something that we find, if you see the pattern, is that this is really just the scientific method, right? We're having them collect ideas and materials, do experiments with them, and then critique or analyze them. And as much as I would love to have 50 students in a lab every week, that's often not possible. And so now we're beginning to use online tools as a way to have students still experiment with data, but really have it on their own terms, especially perhaps in a semester like this. The thing that I love about really not only the scientific method, which we all know and love, but also this process, is that it also well mirrors Bloom's taxonomy, right? This hierarchical understanding of how students can go from simply recalling or repeating information all the way to creating something like a review that can be judged and assessed. And so these are really big ideas that you might not really share with all your students in depth, but they again are always there for them to see in the some of the assignments and tests that we go So this is kind of an overview of what an assignment might look like. You don't need to read all of this right now. I'll post this in the resources later. But you can see, right, there's a little bit of background. It starts with our learning objectives, so the students know very clearly what they're working on, what they're being graded on as well. And then you can see I actually break up the tasks that they do into this collection, analysis, and then presentation. And here, again, it would be sourcing a safety data sheet, going through it, looking at the different sections. I've highlighted some for them to ask certain questions about. And then also, write a small review. Here it's only between 100 and 200 words and would suggest perhaps whether it's safe in your home versus your workplace versus outdoors, which again may not be as rigorous for a chemist or engineer, but for a liberal arts student is a good beginning to decipher whether or not a chemical is safe in a given context. And so what I'll do now is just show the online tool that I use in this assignment to help specifically with the analysis. So, right, how they take all these complex toxicological and environmental concepts and link them or begin to. And so we use Chem Hat, which is a very simple but also really broad tool, which helps you kind of categorize either the stronger or weaker impacts or effects of some of these chemicals. And so I thought, as I like to do with my students, is you actually show them what you're doing, right? So I hope you can all see Chem Hat right now. The one that I did as an example was phenol. And even though this doesn't have all of the information in the MSDS, which they did look at earlier in the assignment, now what they can begin to do is sort of weigh perhaps whether cancer is so much of a risk that you wouldn't use phenol. Another part to the assignment was looking at what a chemical is used for, right? Sometimes the use might almost outweigh. So knowing that it had been used for cleaning and hygiene early on, we have to think about whether the potential for endocrine disruption is doesn't warrant its use. And so the thing that I love about Chem Hat specifically, the reason I chose this tool, was because it has these wonderful questions that it kind of lumps the data under to help kind of guide students. And so one of the most important ones, which I know we look at when we are designing a lot of our materials and labs I've worked in, is are there safer alternatives? And this question is arguably beyond a first level course, right? You're not expecting students to come up with chemical replacements, but it's beginning to get them thinking about whether there is or isn't information on what could replace, say, a chemical like phenol. And so to give just a sense of what this all looks like, right, we have on the right-hand side here an example of somewhat of a finished product. This is rather, small game, right? They're not wagering a lot of points on this single assignment, but it's also having them do something they're probably somewhat uncomfortable with, right? Review a chemical. That sounds like such an odd concept. And I wanted to point out on the right, when we look at grading, which is often what they're most interested in, we can see, right, it's broken down again into this collection, analysis, and presentation. So thinking about the different steps of the assignment, but also scientific method, really. And then, right, giving them ideas of what is considered the best work. There might be a larger rubric, right, online for them to look at as well. And so, you're more than welcome if you may be in some way scrambling for a good assignment for the fall to use something in the style of this. And if not, right, to still use the broader ideas, right, to identify your learning outcomes, especially if you're new to toxicology. You can also have somewhat, perhaps more of a structure than you would for your typical assignment in your class when I give them a list of problem numbers from a textbook to help them be a little more guided through this inquiry process. And then last but not least, I always try to sort of lead their work to something that could be presented, perhaps even to a public audience. And one of the focuses here was to have them write a review, not for their professor, right, but for perhaps their grandmother or a friend, if they should or shouldn't use a chemical. And so, yeah, I mean, again, not something I would necessarily see in a 400 level chem course, but another way, right, to sort of blend the students' backgrounds and interests with also these truly scientific goals of collecting and analyzing data as well in a sort of informal assessment. And so, yeah, I'm going to share the example assignment in the resources later, and know that you're welcome to use Chem Hat. That's not mine, that's free out there. And what I would say is my best tip is don't get too drawn into a single tool, in the sense that sometimes you want to use something because it's really cool, but we always have to think about what students are learning and how they're demonstrating it. So I always like to start with the learning outcomes and then find one of the many tools on the Beyond Benign website or through NIH to help create more sort of not only realistic but digestible assignments for my students. And so yes, this is fresh in the sense that they haven't gotten to try this one yet, but I'm excited to see how they review chemicals that maybe I know of or maybe don't. And then also, of course, as the educator, seeing what was missing in the assignment when I'm done, right? What worked and what didn't. I would be surprised if this worked as well as I would like this first time, but students are very good at finding, where we can still improve as well. And so this is really only one piece of the multiple modules that Doug was just describing. This would be, again, for maybe an introductory class or perhaps lower level, but you could see how you might build this out, including more complex ideas or assessments later on. And so that's a little bit of the work that Doug, I, and Beyond Benign have been working on. And we, of course, would love ideas from you about what types of not only content, but also assignments that you think are important or necessary. I know in my breakout group, there was discussion of analytical chemistry and forensics. We're looking to also help you tailor these things to your subdisciplines as well. And so I think that's all we have for that little intro today. So thank you for listening. And again, in the chat, you can ask questions, or we will go from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Julian. So you do have a question in the chat there if you want to take a scroll back. But what we will be doing is having breakout sessions. So right now, we're going to take a break. So I'm going to say that I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to say, please be back by 1:05. We're running about 5 minutes behind, which I don't think is bad at all for having this as our first go. And we'll have discussion groups after. So I put in the chat, please let me know what breakout group you'd like to go into, either toxicology if that's of interest to you. Next, you're going to be hearing from the Green Labs Fellow. So in the chat, but please feel free, take a break, stretch your legs, get something to eat, all that good stuff. And we'll see you back here at 1:05. Resources. And this is a project that we've had a partnership with MilliporeSigma for quite a few years now. And there is an organic resource guide version that you may be familiar with. An update for that is coming out and being rolled out at the ACS National Conference next week. But I am absolutely thrilled as an inorganic chemist and having the training in my background and really not knowing how to do greener inorganic chemistry to say that MilliporeSigma has funded us for a general chemistry inorganic resource guide. And we are absolutely floored to have with us and working on board John DeBeck from the University of Toronto, who was looking at greening up the labs within the University of Toronto in the last year. And so this is really a strategic and synergetic move for us to come together and to work on this resource together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John. And I know that he has some interesting things to tell you about his past work and some things coming up.
Thanks,
so
Natalie.
John, I'll shift it over to you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so
Looks
thanks.
great.
So I'm from the University of Toronto, which is located in Canada, if you're not familiar. Today I'm just gonna talk a little bit about some of the first steps that we've made to make our inorganic labs a little bit greener. And here's an artist rendition of our campus. It's currently undergoing a revitalization project to make it a greener campus. So hopefully that's aligned with what we're doing or trying to do in the inorganic labs. So just a brief summary about me. In 2013, I got my Bachelor Honors Chemistry from McMaster University, which is about an hour from Toronto. I went on in 2018 to complete my PhD, and that was also done at McMaster. And the area of inorganic chemistry was noble gas and fluorine chemistry. I did some mercury chemistry as well. And overall, I would say this is the complete opposite of green chemistry. This would be what I would call red chemistry. So some of my favorite solvents that I used were freons, so ozone depleting chlorofluorocarbons. I worked in anhydrous hydrogen fluoride, which is extremely, extremely dangerous and toxic. If you get a small amount on you, it can kill you. And then various other reagents and chemicals, neurotoxic ligands. So very non-green chemistry. Then I underwent a year of postdoc research at the University of Toronto under Doug Steffen, and that was starting to become a little bit greener. I did organosulfur, organophosphorus chemistry with potential uses as metal-free catalysts, although a lot of the synthetic routes that we used I wouldn't call green either at that point. And then in 2019, I started as an assistant professor in the teaching stream. So it's focusing on the undergraduate curriculum. And I teach first year general chemistry as well as the labs, the inorganic labs for the upper years. So I think as I've gone through my education, I've slowly been dipping my toe deeper and deeper into the green chemistry pool. And then now I'm at the point as an assistant professor that I'm going to try to learn to swim. So I'm going to try to really dive deeper into green chemistry. And at least that's my goal. So I think a great place to learn how to swim in green chemistry is the University of Toronto. So this is taken from a colleague of mine. They put out a publication. His name's Andy Dix. So he was very heavily involved with the organic green laboratory guide that Natalie mentioned. So essentially, University of Toronto, our department, has really been shifting to incorporate green chemistry since about 2000, where they started to introduce microscale reactions. And then over the years, green chemistry has really started to take over a lot of the organic curriculum. In 2012, we started a student-led organization called the Green Chemistry Initiative, which is focusing on promoting green chemistry and various initiatives. So some of those include purchasing an acetone recycling unit. So we recycle all of our acetone in the department for reuse. We also are piloting a glove recycling program. So the specific gloves that can be recycled and made into various plastic products. In 2016, our department joined the Green Chemistry Commitment. So we're a Green Chemistry Commitment signed university. And since that time, we've continued to move forward. So in 2020, we've been discussing and proposing a focus in green chemistry in our undergraduate program. So if students take a specific number of required courses that have a heavy focus on green chemistry, they can get this transcript notation. And moving forward, which is where I'm coming in now, is trying to introduce more green chemistry into our inorganic curriculum, which if there's inorganic chemists out there, you know, typically isn't a very green space. So that's what I'm hoping to contribute to. So our labs are typically 4-hour periods that run either every week or every other week, depending on the length of the course. And to give a brief overview, I'm not going to go through all this, but this is sort of the labs that we ran at least last year in our second and third year. So in second year, we have about 80 students, and our third year labs are about 40 students. And if you kind of peruse through the different laboratories, they're very transition metal focused. And there's a few that are newer, but overall, it's based off very old chemistry. Most of this is from 1970s, 1980s. And there's a saying, oldie but a goodie, and that's true. Although a lot of these are based off older publications, they have a lot of value, and they're generally pretty good labs, but they're not particularly green. And there's a couple different reasons why, and I'll mention it on the next slide. I also wanted to draw your attention to one of the second year labs. In green, we make this nickel bromide complex, and that's going to be important relating to something I'll mention in a few slides. So they're oldies but goodies, but there are some issues. So the first step I took when I came into my current role, I only had about 2 or 3 weeks until the labs were essentially going to begin. So I didn't have a lot of time to really make large changes, but my first step was just to try to modify the labs in whatever way possible. So typically this was reducing the scale, modifying some solvents and reaction conditions and times. So one example that I'll just mention was a second year experiment. The first one that they do is synthesizing a cobalt ACAC complex. And this is coordination chemistry ligands. And their analysis mostly comes down to, they do a melting point and they look at the IR. So that's really what they need the complex for. And when I looked in the literature, there's this 1980 Chem Ed, which almost word for word was the synthetic procedure used for this experiment. And for that lab, they essentially would synthesize about 6 grams of product per student, assuming the 75% yield. So to give some scale, it's about 2 full scintillation vials, and we have about 80 students. So overall, they're synthesizing about 1/2 kilogram of product, where they really only need to do a melting point and an IR. And for 80 students, they could all do a melting point and an IR probably with about 1/2 scintillation vial. So huge excess of product. So obviously that was one of the first labs that we reduced scale. And in large part, you don't even have to necessarily have this prepared beforehand. So in my case, I didn't. So when we walked into the lab, I essentially just told all my students, all right, we're gonna synthesize everything 1/2 scale. So cut everything in half. And they had to do it that way. So there were no issues. So that's the first step. Looking forward, even if we want to keep essentially the same sort of lab, if it has a lot of pedagogical value in terms of what they're looking at and it's aligned with the curriculum, we can look at trying to alter them for some greener alternatives. So one thing I'm considering and looking at is instead of making a cobalt ACAC complex, they can make the iron 3 ACAC complex. So now we're avoiding the use of cobalt, which if you're familiar with its source is typically mined in the Congo, which is a conflict area. You can use the iron trichloride, so iron 3 precursor. So now you don't have to oxidize the cobalt, so we don't have to use hydrogen peroxide. So a little bit safer, less waste. And you can actually carry out the reaction in water at lower temperatures and higher yield. So overall, it's, I think, a superior, greener lab where the students will get the same synthetic skills and the same results or system that they can analyze. So that was kind of my first step, my baby step, learning how to walk in green chemistry. The second step that we've sort of started to look at more recently is introducing greener labs and green chemistry principles. So we have a fellowship program at U of T where graduate students can sign on in order to work alongside faculty to develop a curriculum or different resources. So we wanted to introduce a third-year lab, which is a nickel catalyzed cross-coupling reaction. And this was largely based off of recent work by Jason Cook at the University of Alberta. And the way we wanted to frame it is in more of a real-life context. So we set it up as the students were hired by a company to explore a nickel pre-catalyst as a greener alternative to replace the current palladium catalysts that are used. And essentially some of the green principles students end up evaluating and looking at is the fact that in comparison, nickel is much more readily available, it's more abundant, it's considerably cheaper, and also is considered less toxic. So those are some of the green principles or ideas that we can start to introduce through this experiment. I won't go into the details on the synthesis, but overall, the techniques that they learn are also pretty valuable or prized within inorganic chemistry. So it's a bit air sensitive. So they have to use some air sensitive techniques. They're doing a Grignard reaction, which is also pretty common. In this case, they're using mazetoline Grignard, which is in fact one of the safest Grignard reagents. It's the bulk of the mesotyl group is what makes it a lot less reactive. So it's actually a safer alternative in that route. And on the previous slide, I mentioned that in the second year, I pointed out in the second year that they actually synthesize a nickel dibromide complex. And that's what we can now use in our third year as our reagent. So now we're reducing waste by using product from other labs as starting materials for this specific experiment. So it's starting to get more of a systems thinking approach where we're connecting the different labs together. So some other ideas that we were trying to explore in terms of making our program a bit more sustainable is looking at partnerships. So typically we have an undergraduate lab, and our relationship to the chemical supplier is that we purchase the reagents. So we buy our reagents, our students undergo the chemistry that they want to explore for the pedagogical value that they can gain and the skills that they need to have. And then once we're done, more likely than not, we just dispose of the products because we haven't set it up to be used. So Andy Dix wanted to start looking at ways that we could reduce our waste in our undergraduate labs. So he thought, well, what if we can try to partner with researchers in our department or other universities, and they can actually use the products that we make. So that's something that we've been trying to explore within our department. Another idea that I had, was what if we could try to partner with the chemical suppliers? So if they have the reagents that we need, what if they're willing to essentially donate the reagents? We can do the activities that we want, and then we can return the products to them, higher value products that they can then supply to various researchers. So kind of a synergetic relationship with the chemical supplier. And that's something that I've been in several discussions and meetings and correspondence trying to establish. And this is just an idea that we're exploring, but I will say it is easier said than done. So far, it's been very, very challenging to get alignment between researchers or chemical suppliers. What they need often isn't really feasible for us to synthesize. And in particular, some of them are dangerous syntheses. So it's very challenging to establish this. So if anyone out there has some sort of similar system, I'd be very interested in hearing a little bit more about that. So what are the next steps? We can continue to evaluate and incorporate green principles into the older labs, as I mentioned, for example, with the iron ACAC replacement, or we can just completely replace or develop new greener labs. So that's what takes us to the fellowship that Natalie mentioned. So I'm really excited to be involved in this project with Beyond Benign and MilliporeSigma. And we're going to look at trying to put together a really valuable, useful resource for inorganic chemistry in order to get some great greener labs put into the undergraduate curriculum. So it also is where you come in. So we want you or your colleagues to help contribute in whatever way possible to really making this the best resource that it can be. So I just want to thank Matt Graditsky, who is a graduate student I mentioned that worked on putting that nickel lab together. And also Professor Andy Dix, who's been a really great mentor and driving force in our department in getting green chemistry more intertwined with the curriculum. So I'm happy to answer any questions or pass it back to you, Natalie. Hopefully I'm on time.
You're perfect, John. That was absolutely perfect. And I did put into the chat, John and I had developed a departmental survey for what are you doing in general chemistry and inorganic chemistry labs. We realized that inorganic chemistry, and I think Irv Levy pointed this out to me, he's like, when you say inorganic chemistry, there may not actually be an inorganic chemistry course. It may be Gen Chem that they label it as that is inorganic chemistry. So we would be open to hearing your resources for general chemistry and inorganic chemistry. We really see this as the time for the community to come together and to build out these resources that are out there into this guide and how we can kind of push forward in this area. We do know from the green chemistry commitment surveys of the signers that inorganic chemistry is kind of the next frontier, that it's the place where organic is really heavily touched, general chemistry is really touched, and inorganic chemistry we see as the next place. So this is really timely in this all coming together. So we are right on time in terms of moving to our breakout rooms. So if John, you want to stop sharing your screen, I will just share mine back. Great. So we are right on time for our breakout room. So if you told me in the chat what topic you are interested in, you will go there. As I'm saying this, I'm realizing that if there is one question, there may be one question in the chat. If you are going to a different breakout room, but you have a question and you'd like that answered by the person that won't be in your breakout room, please feel free to ask. So I am just going to call out a question from Elizabeth Day quickly. I know Elizabeth is going over to the toxicology room, I believe. And so this question comes to you, John, about how are the courses structured and the steps that you talked about, verification-based, individual synthesis, culminating in a lab report. So I don't know if you just want to quickly answer that, as she won't be going into your group with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our labs, it's individual syntheses, and then it typically does culminate in submitting a lab report. So in that specific, for the nickel one that I mentioned, because we're framing it in the context of collaborating with industry, that one is actually kind of an executive report. So we've structured it as if they're filling out kind of a report to send back to the company. They have to do a bunch of calculations to assess which catalyst performs better in terms of turnover number, turnover frequency, and then they have to try to justify which catalyst they think they should use, whether the company should use the palladium one, or if they should actually switch over to this nickel catalyst. And the way it's framed is actually quite nice because the nickel catalyst performs poorer than the palladium catalyst. So there is room for debate in terms of which one they should use.
That's excellent. It makes sense in terms of the partnership, and that's such a cool idea. Have you thought about maybe doing more group work to sort of cut down that way as well? I don't know if that actually generates less waste, but
yeah. So for the nickel one, it is. I wouldn't say it's group work. Half the students will synthesize with the triphenylphosphine, and the other half actually synthesize with a different phosphine. So they're actually comparing which ones are better catalysts. So it's a little bit of catalyst design as well, kind of built in there.
Very exciting. Yeah, very cooperative. Sort of everyone's working on something, and you all. That's very cool.
Thanks. Yeah, there's definitely room to keep improving, but
always. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great. So I am going to send you off into those breakout groups. We do have about 12 people in the toxicology group and 8 people going into the greener labs. A few of you, I know you have to jump off. I understand that 2 hours is a long block of time. So what I am going to do is to just put into the chat box now. If you do have to go, we'd love to hear your feedback in a Google form there. But if you're sticking around with us, I'm going to send you off to those breakout rooms now. You've got a good chunk of time here, about 20-25 minutes, to really talk about anything in the presentations that you heard that you'd like to talk more about, the topic in general. It's up to you. So I'm sending you off to your rooms now. If you change your mind in a topic, you can always come back here. If I send you to the wrong room, you can always come back here. And so happy discussions to you all. Now, I just put a ton of links into the chat. And I'm going to pull up my presentation.
I'm not doing anything. Or others?
So in the chat box, do we see a bunch of links?
Yeah, and we just got cut off by some great perspective from Cecilia and ours. So again, good discussions in the toxicology group, and there's more to be had, but some great insight coming there all the way from Kenya.
Awesome. It's exciting. It's so exciting. We had someone joining us from India that left off when it was past midnight over there. So it's amazing to have you all here and having these conversations. We just want to bring you back together, do a little bit of a wrap up, and to say what's next. So what's next is that we're going to do this again. We've been loving the conversation. I love having you all here and seeing your faces and talking about this. As we know that you may not have this space to do this with your own department this semester, we invite you to invite others from your department to come and to have those interactions here, or to use this as your space of your green chemistry community company. That's fine as well too, but we welcome everyone. So I will just say what's next is that there's a ton of things that I put into this the chat box link. There's a Dropbox there that has shared resources. I didn't get a chance to pop off into the networking group, so there is one resource there from me about what I would do in general chemistry and what I will do in general chemistry online in the fall. And you can add your resources there. Feel free to use that shared space. Also into the chat, I've put the feedback, so please let us know your interest in sharing in the future, how we could do these differently, if there were pieces or parts missing, or if there were things that you really like. We'd love to hear that. And also the departmental survey for general or inorganic chemistry. We'll make sure to follow up with all of these links in a follow-up email as well. But if you are the person within your department that does general or inorganic chemistry, we'd love to have your feedback. If it's not you, please share it on with your colleagues. We'd love to collect the information so that guide can be as useful as possible to the green chemistry community. So I'll say our next connection is on September 9th. We already have 2 speakers lined up, which seems like a great process here that we've got going, is that people get excited and doing those short kind of 10-minute talks. It's supposed to be a kind of get people interested, have a conversation starter overall. So we have Felicia Eckhorn from Virginia Tech, who's going to be talking about an upper level green chemistry course, and she has a green chemistry textbook based around the green chemistry principles that I'm sure she'll talk about. And then also green chemistry and the connection between the UN SDGs and racial inequality in chemistry from Ed Brush. I know Ed was here with us earlier, but he had to pop off. I know he's really excited about that work and continuing it on as well, even outside of these discussions. So with that, I'll say thank you all for your time today. If there's any kind of final thoughts or anything you want to share, we'd love to hear it, but that's all we've got for today. Please send us your feedback, and it's been lovely seeing you. I don't know if we can get a group photo. I don't know if Amy's got that power over there. She's very good at it. If we all want to take a...
If I can get it into the other mode, but for some reason it's not getting into another mode for me. But it's so wonderful seeing all your faces. Oh, there it is. There's the grid mode. All right, 3, 2, 1. Yay. All right. Thank you, guys. So wonderful to see all your faces and to hear your voices. So thank you. Looking forward to next time.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.